The year 1867 smelled of dust and fear. The town of Redemption, a name dripping with an irony so thick you could choke on it, clung to the parched Texas plains like a stubborn burr. Its buildings were skeletal, fashioned from splintered wood bleached gray by a relentless sun. Red dust, fine as milled flour, settled on everything: the brims of hats, the bottoms of whiskey glasses, the lashes of sleeping children. It was a place built on grit, both the kind you found under your fingernails and the kind you needed in your soul to survive. The wind was a constant preacher here, its sermons howling through the gaps between buildings, carrying with it the scent of sage and the low, mournful moan of a land that had seen too much blood seep into its soil. Tension was the currency of redemption. It was exchanged in the hard, unblinking stares between the white settlers and the few Mexican families who clung to their ancestral lands. It was felt in the way a man's hand would instinctively drop to the butt of his Colt when a band of natives was spotted on the distant horizon, their forms shimmering like heat devils. This was a world of hard lines drawn in the dirt, and crossing them was a good way to end up fertilizing it. Elias was a man who walked those lines, though he tried to make his steps as light as possible, young, with a quiet strength that settled in his shoulders from years of hard labor. He lived a life of deliberate solitude. He worked as a hired hand on the Miller Ranch, a sprawling, unforgiving piece of land just a mile from town. He occupied a small, lean-to cabin attached to the main barn, preferring the company of horses to the boisterous, often cruel, chatter of the bunkhouse. He was a man of few words and quiet hands, a disposition that the folks in Redemption mistook for simplicity. But Elias had a depth they never saw. In the quiet hours before dawn, he would sometimes leave a small sack of flour on the porch of the struggling blacksmith, or a strip of dried venison near the camp of a family whose wagon had broken an axle. These were small, secret acts of kindness in a world that rewarded cruelty. He did them not for thanks, but because he carried a deep, abiding ache for the suffering of others, an empathy that was as much a burden as a virtue in this harsh land. The winter came down on the plains like a hammer blow. The wind traded its mournful moan for a sharp, vicious shriek, and the red dust was replaced by a biting sleet that turned the world to a uniform, unforgiving gray. It was on one such night, the air so cold it felt like shattered glass in the lungs, that Elias found her. He was checking a line of traps he'd set along the frozen banks of Willow Creek, his breath pluming in the weak light of his lantern. It wasn't a sound that first caught his attention, but a stillness, a patch of darkness against the snow that was too deliberate, too wrong. He approached cautiously, his rifle held ready. The lantern light slid over a crumpled shape, half hidden by a snow-dusted thicket. At first, he thought it was a deer, fallen to a wolf or the cold. Then he saw the cascade of black hair, a stark river against the white, and the delicate, still form of a hand. She was a native girl, no older than himself, dressed in tattered, blood-soaked doeskin. Her face was a mask of dirt and drying blood, her body contorted in a way that spoke of unimaginable violence. A deep gash ran along her temple, and one arm was bent at an unnatural angle. He knelt, pressing two gloved fingers to her neck. He expected the cold, still flesh of the dead. Instead, he felt a pulse, faint, thready, but there, a flicker of life in the frozen wasteland. His eyes scanned the surrounding snow. The tracks told a grim story, the chaotic prints of shod horses, the scuffs of a one-sided struggle, and the chilling, final stillness. There were no other bodies, no other signs of life. She was alone, the sole survivor of what could only have been a slaughter. The wind shrieked, and in its voice, Elias heard the town's judgment. "Leave her. It's not your fight." To be found with a native, especially a wounded one, was a death sentence. They'd call him a sympathizer, a traitor, the sheriff, a man whose sense of justice was as barren as the land itself, would string him up from the nearest cottonwood without a second thought. And the girl, she would be finished off, her life extinguished as carelessly as a spent match. He looked down at her face. Even through the grime, there was a fierce beauty to it, a strength in the line of her jaw that even unconsciousness could not erase. The pulse beneath his fingers was a desperate, silent plea. He thought of the small acts of kindness he performed in secret, gestures that cost him little. This would cost him everything. With a groan that was part effort, part prayer, Elias scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. He carried her back towards the ranch, every crunch of his boots in the snow sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. He didn't take her to his cabin, but to the barn, the place he felt safest. He laid her gently in an empty stall, piling fresh, sweet-smelling hay around her for warmth. For the rest of that night, and for many nights that followed, the barn became a secret hospital, a sanctuary hidden in plain sight. Elias became a tender, meticulous nurse. He carefully cleaned the gash on her temple with whiskey from his flask, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle as he stitched it closed with a needle and horsehair. He set her broken arm, binding it with strips of torn flour sack and splints of wood. He kept a low fire burning in a small brazier, its warmth a fragile shield against the winter. He would sit by her side for hours, coaxing spoonfuls of warm broth and water between her cracked lips. She drifted in and out of consciousness for days. When she was awake, her eyes dark, intelligent, and filled with a pain so profound it made his own heart ache, would follow his every move. They were the eyes of a cornered animal, wary and untrusting. He spoke to her in low, soothing tones, though he knew she didn't understand his words. Slowly, he began to teach her. He would point to the bucket and say, "Water." He would touch his chest and say his name. "Elias." He would gesture to her and wait. After a week, a raw, hoarse whisper came from her lips. "Naya." Her name was Naya. It felt momentous, a bridge built across a chasm of silence and mistrust. The long nights spun into weeks. Naya's body began to heal, the color returning to her cheeks. She would watch him as he mended tack or groomed the horses. Her silence, a constant, observant presence. They developed a language of their own, one made of gestures, glances, and the shared space of their quiet confinement. He would show her a picture in an old newspaper, and she would trace a shape in the dirt with a stick, telling a story he could only half guess at. In these stolen moments, something new and dangerous began to grow between them. It was a tenderness born of shared vulnerability. He saw not just a native girl, but Naya, the woman who had a small, determined scar on her chin, who hummed a soft, mournful tune when she thought he wasn't listening, whose eyes could hold both the desolation of her loss and an unquenchable fire. He fought it. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him. The world outside the barn doors had no place for this feeling. The prejudices of redemption were etched into his mind like commandments carved in stone. She was the other, the enemy, a forbidden territory. To even think of her in that way was to invite disaster. He held himself back, building a wall of restraint around his heart, keeping his touch clinical, his words practical. But walls, no matter how carefully built, can crumble. One night, a fever took hold of Naya. It came on suddenly, racking her body with violent shivers. Her skin was fire to the touch, and her eyes were glazed over, seeing things far beyond the dusty confines of the stall. She began to murmur in her own tongue, the words frantic and pleading. He bathed her forehead with cool water, trying to soothe her, but the fever held her in its grip. Then, in a moment of startling clarity, she cried out a single word, one that needed no translation. It was the name of her mother. The sound was a raw, guttural cry of such pure, desperate longing that it shattered the last of Elias's defenses. It was the sound of a heartbreaking, of a child lost in an endless, terrifying darkness. He could no longer keep his distance. He sat on the hay beside her and gathered her into his arms, pulling her trembling body against his chest. He held her tight, rocking her gently as if she were a small child, his hand stroking her sweat-damp hair. He whispered nonsense, words of comfort, words of safety, words he knew she couldn't understand but hoped she could feel. She quieted in his arms, her delirious cries softening to ragged sobs that shook them both. He held her like that for hours, the warmth of the brazier casting their two shadows as one against the rough-hewn wood of the barn. The storm of her fever raged, but in the heart of that storm, Elias held her fast. In that moment, there was no black or white, no settler or native, no hunter or hunted. There were only two souls, clinging to one another in the dark, and a fragile, terrifying, an undeniable love being born from the ashes of grief. The winter's thaw was a slow, agonizing surrender. The ice on Willow Creek cracked and groaned like a dying man, and the plains bled a muddy brown before finally, reluctantly, offering up the first pale green shoots of spring. In the quiet world of the barn, a similar, gradual healing was taking place. Naya, once a fragile collection of broken bones and fever dreams, began to reclaim her strength. The vacant look in her eyes was replaced by a sharp, assessing intelligence, and she moved with a growing, fluid grace that spoke of a life spent in tune with the earth. Their days fell into a silent, rhythmic partnership. She learned to live in the shadows, a ghost in Elias's world. While he was out on the range, she remained confined to the barn, the scent of hay and horsehide the only air she breathed. But when he returned, they worked together. She would help him clean and oil the leather tack, her small, deft hands moving with a purpose that seemed to restore a piece of her spirit. He taught her how to groom the horses, and he watched, a strange tightness in his chest, as the powerful animals grew calm and docile under her touch. They rarely spoke. Theirs was a language woven from the spaces between words, a shared glance across the back of a mare, a nod of understanding when he passed her a tool, the way he would leave a plate of food for her by the stall and return to find it empty. A silent communion. The barn became their universe, a fragile bubble of existence sealed off from the judgment of redemption. In this quiet world, he was not a white man and she was not a native. They were simply Elias and Naya, two solitary beings who had found an unlikely harbor in one another. But the harbor was not a home, and the silence between them was beginning to fill with a tension that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a longing that grew more potent with each passing day. Elias felt it as a constant, low burn in his gut. He would watch her as she sat in a patch of sunlight slanting through the barn door, her dark hair shining, and an ache would seize him, so sharp and fierce it stole his breath. He had saved her life, but he was a prisoner of his own act, trapped between his desire and the certain ruin it would bring. One night, the spring air was warm and thick with the smell of damp earth and blooming sage. A full moon, bright as a freshly minted silver dollar, hung in the ink-black sky, spilling its liquid light across the plains. Naya stood at the main barn door, staring out at the illuminated landscape with an expression of such profound yearning that Elias felt it like a physical blow. She had not been outside, truly outside, since the night he found her. The words left his mouth before he could stop them. "Come!" She turned, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. He took the risk. He led her out of the barn, away from the ranch house, and down the gentle slope towards the creek. The world was awoken by the moonlight. Every blade of grass, every stone, was etched in silver and shadow. Naya drank it in, her head tilted back, her face a mask of wonder and relief. At the creek's edge, she knelt and dipped her hands into the cold, clear water, splashing it on her face as if performing a sacred rite. Elias watched her, and the walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart crumbled to dust. Seeing her there, bathed in moonlight, a part of the wild, beautiful land she belonged to, he knew he was lost. The months of restraint, of denial, of telling himself this was a duty and not a desire, evaporated in the warm night air. When she stood up, her face glistening, he was there. He reached out and his hand, calloused and rough, cupped her cheek. It was a gesture of such aching tenderness that she flinched, not in fear, but in surprise. Her eyes searched his, asking a question he could no longer leave unanswered. He closed the small distance between them, and his mouth found hers. It was not a gentle coming together, but a desperate, frantic claiming. It was a kiss that tasted of dust and moonlight, of loneliness and a fierce, unquenchable need. It was a collision of two worlds, a surrender to a force more powerful than prejudice, more fundamental than fear. In his arms, she was not a secret or a danger. She was the only real thing in his empty life. And for her, in that moment, he was not her savior or her jailer. He was the anchor in a world that had tried to wash her away. They sank to the soft grass by the riverbank, and under the silent, watchful eye of the moon, they came together not just as man and woman, but as two survivors finding a fleeting, ferocious proof that they were still alive. The dawn, when it came, felt like a judgment. The soft, forgiving moonlight was burned away by the harsh, clarifying rays of the sun. As they lay by the creek, the world rushed back in, and with it came the cold, sharp talons of fear. The magic was gone, replaced by the stark reality of their transgression. They walked back to the barn in a new, heavier silence. Elias's mind was a maelstrom of panic. Every sound, the distant lowing of cattle, the crow of a rooster, was an alarm bell. He had not just crossed a line, he had set fire to it. The image of a hangman's noose swayed in his mind's eye. Naya, too, was changed. A haunted look had returned to her eyes. She was a ghost again, but now a different kind. Before, she was a phantom from a past tragedy. Now, she was a phantom in a future that could not exist. The night had given her everything, and in doing so, had shown her exactly how much she stood to lose. She was a temporary soul, a ghost in residence, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her time was running out. It was a child who brought their world crashing down. A boy named Samuel, the blacksmith's son, no more than 7 years old, chasing a runaway kite. The kite dipped and danced on the wind, leading him far from town and onto the edge of the Miller Ranch property. It finally snagged on the corner of the barn roof. As Samuel worked to free the string, he glanced towards the barn's open doorway. For a fleeting second, he saw her, a woman with hair as black as a raven's wing. Her face turned towards the light, her expression one of profound sadness. He saw her for only a heartbeat before she retreated back into the shadows. But the image was burned into his memory. A child's observation in a town like Redemption was like a spark in a dry field, Samuel told his father. The blacksmith, a gossip of the highest order, told the men at the saloon. The story grew, twisted, and took on the ugly shape of the town's deepest fears. Miller's quiet farmhand, hiding a savage. The whispers slithered through the dusty streets, poisoning the air, until they reached the ears of the law. They came on a Tuesday morning, a troop of 6 soldiers, their blue uniforms a stark, brutal color against the brown landscape, their rifles held with casual authority. Elias was mending a fence when he saw them approach, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He had known this day would come. The captain, a man with a hard, sunburnt face and eyes devoid of pity, dismounted. "Elias?" he asked, though it wasn't a question. "That's me." Elias's voice was steady, but his hands trembled. "We have reports you're harboring a native fugitive, a survivor from the Red Creek massacre." "Just me here," Elias lied, his throat dry. The captain smiled, a cruel, thin slash across his face. "Don't play me for a fool, son. We know she's in there. Now, you have a choice. You can give her to us, and we'll forget you broke the law. You walk away. Or You can make this difficult, and I'll see you hang for a traitor before lunchtime. Your life or hers." The world narrowed to the space between the captain's cold eyes and the dark doorway of the barn. It wasn't a choice. It was a sentence. His own life, hollow and meaningless as it now seemed, versus a noble, pointless death. He thought of Naya. He had saved her from one death only to deliver her to another. The irony was a bitter acid in his throat. Slowly, like a man walking to his own execution, he turned and walked to the barn. He slid the heavy door open. Naya stood in the center of the barn, caught in a brilliant shaft of morning light. She must have heard everything. Her face was calm, her posture erect. There was no fear in her eyes, no anger, no pleading. There was only a vast, devastating emptiness. She looked at him, and in that gaze, he saw the death of everything they had shared. They were not the eyes of the woman he had held by the river, the woman whose name he had whispered in the dark. They were the eyes of a stranger, looking at the man who had just broken her world in two. Two soldiers moved past him, their boots loud on the wooden planks. They grabbed her arms. She did not resist. Her quiet dignity was more cutting than any scream. As they dragged her out into the unforgiving sunlight, her eyes never left his. That look of profound betrayal and shattered trust was a brand that seared itself onto his soul. It would haunt his waking hours and torment his dreams for the rest of his days. He watched them tie her hands and force her onto a horse. He watched them ride away. Naya, a small, straight-backed figure swallowed by the dust and the distance. Later, he would hear that she had been taken to Fort Griffin, registered in a ledger not by name, but as Prisoner 37, female, native, a valuable survivor. A curiosity, a piece of property. From that day on, Elias lived as a shadow. He did his work, he ate his meals, he drew his breath, but he was no longer truly alive. The man who had secretly helped the poor, the man who had risked everything for a stranger, was gone. In his place was a hollow shell of a man, haunted by the ghost of a love he had been forced to betray. The smile never returned to his face. A decade is a lifetime on the plains. 10 years of relentless sun can turn a young man old, and 10 years of drought can turn a hopeful settlement into a graveyard. The year was now 1877, and redemption was dying of thirst. The red dust was no longer just a coating. It was the very substance of the air they breathed, the grit in their food, the haze that blurred the horizon. Willow Creek was a dry, cracked scar on the face of the land, and the cattle were bony specters haunting a landscape of brittle, yellowed grass. Elias was a man of 31, though he looked a decade older. The last 10 years had hammered him into a different shape, much like the iron he now worked. After leaving the Miller Ranch, unable to bear the ghost-filled silence of the barn, he had apprenticed himself to the town's aging blacksmith. When the old man died, Elias took over the forge. It was fitting work. The blistering heat, the deafening clang of hammer on anvil, the brute, mindless force required. It all served to drown out the memories. He lived in a small room behind the smithy, his life pared down to the essentials: work, eat, sleep, and try not to remember the look in Naya's eyes. The quiet, empathetic boy was gone, buried under a decade of regret. In his place was a man forged in silence and soot. His shoulders were permanently stooped, his hands a roadmap of scars and calluses, and his face was set in a permanent, weary mask. He was a fixture in the town, reliable and morose, a man who shod their horses and mended their plows, but shared none of their company. He was a ghost of a different sort, haunting his own life. The morning began like any other, with a brassy, unforgiving sun climbing a sky the color of rust. Elias was at his anvil, the rhythmic asterisk clang, 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 asterisk, a familiar heartbeat in the otherwise still town. Then, the rhythm broke. The hammering from the new church construction ceased. The shouts of children playing in the street died away. A strange, Expectant silence fell over Redemption, thick and heavy as the dust itself. Elias wiped a sweat-slick arm across his brow and stepped out from the sweltering darkness of the forge into the blinding glare. He looked down the main street, following the gaze of the few townspeople who had frozen in place. On the western horizon, where the sky met the plains, a cloud was rising. It was not the familiar, slow-moving plume of a cattle drive, nor the thin, scattered dust of a lone rider. This was a solid, deliberate wall of red, a moving front that spoke of numbers, of purpose, of an inexorable advance. Fear, a sensation Elias hadn't truly felt in years, coiled in his gut. A low murmur rippled through the onlookers. The sheriff, a portly, self-important man named Barlow, hurried out of his office, buckling his gun belt. "What in God's name is it?" someone whispered. As the cloud drew nearer, it resolved into individual shapes, riders, dozens of them, moving not with the chaotic energy of a raiding party, but with the disciplined cadence of a cavalry troop. They were a strange and terrifying sight, a legion of the lost. There were native warriors, their faces grim, but they rode alongside black men brandishing old army sabers, Mexican vaqueros in worn leather, and even a handful of hard-faced white men and women who looked as though the world had stripped them of everything but their anger. It was an army of outcasts, a tapestry of the wronged, and at its head rode a single figure on a powerful black stallion. The figure was a woman. She sat her horse with an easy, unshakable authority that drew every eye. She was not dressed in buckskin or a calico dress, but in a uniform of her own design, a tailored deerskin jacket, dark trousers, and knee-high boots. A single eagle feather was braided into her long, black hair. A beautifully crafted rifle rested in a scabbard by her knee, and a Colt revolver was holstered low on her hip. She was a vision of power, a warrior queen born from the dust and blood of the frontier. The small detachment of soldiers stationed in Redemption scrambled to form a pathetic defensive line across the street, their rifles looking like toys against the approaching tide. Sheriff Barlow stood before them, puffing out his chest in a blustering show of bravado. The riders stopped 100 yards from the edge of town, a silent, menacing line. The woman at their head raised a hand and then urged her stallion forward, alone. She rode at a slow, deliberate walk, her gaze sweeping over the terrified faces of the townspeople, her expression unreadable. She stopped 20 yards from the sheriff. Elias watched, his heart a trip hammer against his ribs. There was something in the way she held her head, in the proud line of her shoulders. That was achingly, impossibly familiar. A memory buried under a mountain of guilt struggled to break free. "This is the town of Redemption!" Barlow shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "State your business or be met with force!" The woman's voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was as clear and sharp as chipped flint, carrying easily across the dusty space between them. "I know the name of this town," she said, her English perfect, with only a trace of an accent he couldn't quite place. "I am here on business, the business of justice." A nervous tremor went through the line of soldiers. "We seek no bloodshed today," the woman continued, her eyes locking onto the sheriff's. "I have come for what is mine. I have come for the people you hold in bondage, the natives and freedmen working your ranches for no wages. I have come for an accounting of the attack at Red Creek 10 years ago. I am here to see that the forgotten are remembered, and the guilty are named." Elias's hammer slipped from his grasp, falling to the dust with a dull thud. The world tilted on its axis. The sound of her voice, the mention of Red Creek, the pieces slammed into place in his mind with the force of a physical blow. It was Naya. He stumbled forward a few steps, his eyes wide with disbelief. This could not be the same person. The girl he had pulled from the frozen creek was gone. The timid, silent woman who had helped him in the barn was gone. The memory he had carried of her, vulnerable, betrayed, broken, was a lie. This woman was none of those things. This woman was forged from iron and fire, a commander who had risen from the ashes he had left her in. She was magnificent and terrible, and the sight of her stole the air from his lungs. As if feeling the intensity of his stare, her gaze swept away from the sheriff and moved across the crowd. For a single, heart-stopping moment, her eyes met his. 10 years collapsed into a single second. He saw it all in that look. The barn, the moonlight, the creek, the betrayal. He opened his mouth, her name a silent prayer on his lips. But the eyes that looked back at him held nothing. There was no flicker of recognition, no hint of their shared past, no echo of the love or the pain. Her gaze was cold, impersonal, appraising. It was the look a general gives a dusty, insignificant town, the look a strategist gives a minor obstacle on a map. She saw a blacksmith covered in soot, another anonymous face in a crowd of enemies, and then her eyes moved on. That single empty glance was more devastating than any accusation. It did not condemn him, it erased him. It declared that their past, the secret that had defined and destroyed his life for a decade, had never existed for her at all. The girl he betrayed was dead. In her place stood a commander, and to her, Elias was nothing more than a stranger. The arrival of Naya's army threw redemption into a state of quiet, simmering panic. The initial shock gave way to a grim and stubborn fury. In the stuffy back room of the saloon, a self-appointed town council convened. Sheriff Barlow, rancher Jedediah Henderson, a man whose wealth was built on cheap labor and government land grants, and a handful of other prominent citizens gathered around a table littered with whiskey glasses. Their talk was of negotiation, of peace, of understanding. "We must be diplomatic," Henderson declared, his voice a smooth, reasonable baritone. "We need to hear their grievances, find a peaceful solution." But their eyes told a different story. They were the hard, calculating eyes of men protecting their interests. While they spoke of peace, they dispatched runners to the outlying ranches, their whispered orders not of diplomacy, but of ammunition. "Gather every man who can hold a rifle," Barlow muttered to his deputy. "Have them slip into town after dark. We'll talk to the squaw, string her along, but we're not giving up a damn thing." The plan was simple. Feign compliance, wait for an opportunity, and crush the rebellion under the cover of a righteous defense. It was the time-honored logic of redemption. From the shadows of his forge, Elias watched it all. He saw the furtive meetings, the men slipping out of town, the nervous energy that crackled in the air. He knew these men. He knew their greed, their hypocrisy, their deep-seated hatred disguised as piety. They weren't preparing for a negotiation. They were preparing for a slaughter. And Naya, for all her strength and her army, was walking into a trap. The blankness of her gaze that morning had hollowed him out, but the town's treachery filled that hollow with a cold, clear purpose. He had failed her once out of fear for his own life. He would not fail her again out of apathy. He owed her the truth, not just the truth of his own pathetic story, but the truth of the town's venomous intent. Waiting until morning would be too late. He had to go to her. Now, when the moon rose, casting the dead town in a ghostly silver light, Elias moved. He saddled his most sure-footed horse, not the fastest but the quietest. He avoided the main street, sticking to the back alleys, his movements as silent as the shadows he slipped through. He rode out of town not to the west, where her army was camped, but to the south, making a wide, looping circle through the arid hills to approach her camp from the rear, hoping to avoid the patrols he knew she would have posted. The camp was nothing like he expected. It was a place of quiet order. The fires were small, contained, giving off little smoke. Sentries stood watch, not as a loose collection of men, but as disciplined soldiers. He was 50 yards out when a low voice cut through the darkness. "Hold there." 2 figures emerged from the shadows, rifles leveled at his chest. "State your name and business." His heart hammered against his ribs. "My name is Elias. I need to speak to your commander. I need to speak to Naya." Saying her name felt like a violation, a claim he had no right to make. The sentries exchanged a look. One of them disappeared into the darkness, while the other kept his rifle trained on Elias's heart. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Elias waited, the cool night air doing nothing to quell the fire of anxiety in his veins. Finally, the sentry returned. "She will see you. Alone. Leave your horse and your gun." They led him through the camp, past rows of sleeping figures wrapped in blankets, past the low murmur of conversations in a half-dozen different languages. They stopped before a larger tent, set slightly apart from the others. A single, small fire burned outside it. "Go," the sentry said, and melted back into the night. She was sitting by the fire, a simple blanket draped over her shoulders. The commander's uniform was gone, replaced by a simple tunic and trousers. In the flickering firelight, she looked younger. The hard edges of authority softened, but the weariness of 10 years was etched around her eyes. She did not look up as he approached, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Elias stopped a few feet away, his hands feeling large and useless at his sides. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the crackle and pop of the fire. This was it. A decade of unspoken words, of corrosive guilt, lay between them. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and devoid of emotion. "Why are you here, blacksmith?" The word, blacksmith, was a deliberate blow, a reminder of the chasm between them now. I had to warn you," he stammered, his voice rough. "The town. They're talking peace, but they're gathering guns. They mean to attack you." She gave a slight, humorless smile, her eyes still on the fire. I know what kind of men live in redemption. I did not come here expecting honest words." His warning, the one thing that had propelled him here, was dismissed as obvious. He was left with nothing but the raw, gaping wound of their past. "Naya," he began, the name a painful whisper. At that, she finally looked up, and the full, unshielded force of her gaze hit him. The cold mask was gone. In its place was a pain so deep and so old it was terrifying. "Do not use that name," she said, her voice a razor's edge. "That girl died in a fort, wondering why the man who saved her life would throw it away to save his own." The accusation, so direct and so true, shattered him. "I was a coward," he said, the words tasting like ash. "I was scared. They would have hanged me." "And they would have killed me," she countered, her voice rising slightly. "Did you think they were taking me to a Sunday social? Did you imagine they would be kind?" She stood up, a sudden, explosive movement. The blanket fell from her shoulders. "You chose your life. You made your choice by handing me to them." "It has been no life," he burst out, the words tearing from his throat, raw and ragged with a decade of torment. "Every day for 10 years, I have seen your face when they dragged you away. Every night, I have lived with what I did. I hammer iron all day just to make a noise loud enough to drown out the memory of your eyes. I am not that boy anymore. Naya, that boy died that morning. 2. He took a step towards her, his hands clenched into fists. "I never stopped thinking about you, not for one day. I lived in that town, a ghost, punishing myself because I didn't have the courage to die with you." "Your punishment was a choice," she spat back, her eyes blazing with a furious, fiery light. "My survival was not— Do not speak to me of your suffering. You know nothing of it." They stood there, chest to chest, their ragged breaths mingling in the cold night air, the space between them electric with a decade of unspoken rage and grief. The anger had burned away the layers of commander and blacksmith, of survivor and betrayer. All that was left was the raw, undeniable truth, the man and the woman by the creek, their story violently interrupted. He saw the tears shimmering in her eyes before they could fall, and in that moment, the anger broke, and something else, something far more powerful and dangerous, rushed in to fill the void. He didn't know who moved first. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek, just as he had that night by the water. She leaned into his touch for a split second, a shudder running through her body, a decade of loneliness encapsulated in that single, involuntary movement. Then it was broken. A sob, sharp and violent, escaped her, and she pushed him away. But he held on, pulling her back. The argument was over. The words were gone. All that was left was a desperate, primal need. He crushed his mouth to hers, and it was not a kiss of tenderness, but a desperate, furious collision. It was a kiss of anger and apology, of grief, and a longing so profound it had starved them both. She fought him for a moment, her fists beating against his chest, and then, with a cry, she surrendered. Her arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer, her fingers digging into his back. This was not the gentle exploration of their first night together. This was a storm, a wildfire, a desperate attempt to burn away 10 years of pain and reclaim a single moment of life. Their hands tore at clothes, heedless of the cold, their bodies seeking the solace of touch, the brutal honesty of skin against skin. They fell to the ground by the fire, a tangle of limbs and a decade of repressed desire. It was a savage, desperate coming together, a confirmation that beneath the armor and the guilt, the two people who had found each other in a winter storm were still there, still breathing, still capable of feeling something other than pain. The world fell away, leaving only the heat of the fire, the cold of the earth, and the searing, desperate reality of each other. The first hint of dawn was a pale, gray line on the eastern horizon when Elias awoke. The fire had burned down to a pile of glowing orange embers, casting a weak, dying light. He was alone. Naya was gone. The blanket she had worn was neatly folded on the spot where she had lain. It was as if she had never been there at all. He sat up, the cold air a shock against his bare skin. He was alone by the dying fire, the taste of her still on his lips, the scent of her on his skin, more lost and uncertain than he had ever been in his life. Elias slipped back into redemption like a phantom, the gray, pre-dawn light providing a thin cover for his return. The town was the same collection of weathered wood and dusty streets, but something within him had irrevocably shifted. The cold ashes of the campfire, the weight of Naya's absence beside him, the raw, unresolved tempest of their night together. It had all reawaked a part of him that had been dormant for a decade. He was no longer a numb ghost haunting his own life. He was a man with a splinter of feeling lodged deep in his soul, and it ached with every step he took. He returned to the forge, the familiar scent of coal and iron offering no comfort. He stoked the embers, the muscle memory of his work taking over, but his mind was far away, back in the hills, in a camp of outcasts led by a woman forged from his own failure. He looked at the faces of the people passing by his open doorway. Before, they were just customers, familiar shapes in the landscape of his penance. Now, he saw the fear in their eyes, the hard set of their jaws, the suspicion they cast upon each other. He saw the deep, rotten core of redemption, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that they would never choose peace. His fears were confirmed before noon. Sheriff Barlow and the rancher, Henderson, stood in the middle of the street, speaking in low, conspiratorial tones they mistakenly thought were private. Elias, hidden in the shadows of his smithy, heard every word. "Her deadline is sunset tomorrow," Henderson said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "She wants an answer about the workers and this nonsense inquiry." "She'll get her answer," Barlow sneered, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, straight from the barrel of a rifle. "The men from the ranches will be in position by tomorrow night. We'll wait for the moon to set. Then we move in. We'll hit them while they're sleeping. A quick, decisive strike. We'll call it suppressing an insurrection. It'll be over before sunrise." The casual cruelty of it, the smug certainty of their victory, sent a wave of nausea through Elias. This wasn't a defense. It was a planned massacre, a bloody echo of the very crime Naya had returned to condemn. The night they had shared was no longer just a moment of resurrected passion. It was a desperate, fleeting connection before an impending annihilation. His own guilt, his own pain. It all seemed small and selfish in the face of the carnage to come. He had to warn her. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was the only act that held any meaning. He waited until the afternoon sun beat down, hoping the heat would make the town sleepy and inattentive. He didn't even try to be clever. He walked to the stable, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Intending to take his horse and ride as fast as he could, he didn't get 10 feet into the cool, hay-scented darkness before 2 of Barlow's deputies stepped out from an empty stall, shotguns leveled at his chest. "Going somewhere, blacksmith?" one of them drawled. "Figured you might try and run back to your savage lover," the other added. Someone had seen him leave the night before. Someone had been watching. The trap hadn't just been for Naya. It was for him, too. They dragged him from the stable and marched him down the main street. The townspeople emerged from their homes and shops, their faces a mixture of fear and righteous anger. "Traitor!" someone yelled. The word was picked up by others, a venomous chant that followed him all the way to the sheriff's office. Barlow was waiting for him, a triumphant smirk on his face. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. They threw Elias into one of the 2 small, suffocating jail cells and locked the heavy iron door behind him. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was Barlow's satisfied face, the face of a man who had just tidied up a loose end. The cell was a small, stone box that smelled of stale sweat and despair. A single, high window, barred and thick with grime, let in a sliver of oppressive yellow light. As his eyes adjusted, he realized he was not alone. A large figure sat on the cot in the corner, his form almost entirely lost in the shadows. "Took them long enough to throw you in here." A deep, calm voice rumbled from the darkness. "I was beginning to wonder if they'd just shoot you in the street." The figure leaned forward into the light. He was a black man, perhaps 20 years older than Elias, with a powerful build gone slightly soft from imprisonment. His face was kind, etched with lines of hardship, but his eyes held a sharp, unwavering intelligence. "Who are you?" Elias asked, his voice hoarse. "Name's Josiah. I was a handout at the Henderson Ranch," the man said. "Or I was, until I made the mistake of asking for the wages I was owed." Henderson called it theft of his time. Barlow called it inciting unrest. Elias slumped against the wall, the full weight of his failure crushing him. "They're going to attack her camp, tomorrow night." "I know," Josiah said calmly. "I heard them talking. They're not quiet men." He looked at Elias with an unnerving perception. "I saw you ride into her camp last night. I was on watch." Elias stared at him, stunned. "You're one of them?" "I am one of the people she fights for," Josiah corrected gently. "She freed my family from a man who thought the Emancipation Proclamation was just a suggestion. She gave us a place, a purpose. She gives that to all the forgotten people." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "She is a great commander, a leader of men. She has built an armor of command around herself, piece by piece, for 10 long years. But I saw her face after you left this morning. That armor was cracked." "She doesn't remember me," Elias said, the words tasting like a lie even as he spoke them. "She looked at me, like I was a stranger." Josiah let out a low, soft chuckle. "Son, that woman has done nothing but remember you for 10 years. Forgetting you would have been a mercy she was never granted. Don't you understand what you are to her? You are the man who saved her, and you are the man who broke her. You are the beginning and the end of her old life. She didn't look at you like a stranger because she didn't know you. She looked at you like that because she knew you better than anyone else, and she was terrified of what it would do to her." The word struck Elias with the force of a physical blow, rearranging everything he thought he knew. "She didn't come back here for revenge," Josiah continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Don't you fall for that. Vengeance is a fool's errand. She came back for justice, not just for her people, but for mine, for the orphans, the outcasts, the ones this world chews up and spits out. She's not trying to burn down the past. She's trying to build a future where a town like Redemption can't simply wipe a people off the face of the earth and call it progress. Josiah leaned back into the shadows. She came back here knowing she might have to face you, and she built that wall around her heart to survive the encounter. But you, blacksmith, you got past it, and now she's out there, preparing for a battle with her armor cracked, all because of you. Outside, the world was changing. The sliver of yellow light from the window began to dim, replaced by an ominous, orange-brown glow. A low moan began in the distance, a sound that grew steadily into a deep, guttural howl. The wind. It hurled handfuls of sand and grit against the stone walls of the jail. A dust storm, massive and violent, was descending upon Redemption. It was a physical manifestation of the coming chaos, a shroud for the battle to come. Elias looked at Josiah, then at the barred window where the world was dissolving into a maelstrom of red dust. Everything was clear now. His guilt, his fear for his own life, it was all dust. What mattered was Naya, not the ghost of her that had haunted him, but the real, living woman who was about to face a massacre, her resolve shaken because of him. He had to get to her, not just to warn her, but to stand with her, to be the man he should have been 10 years ago. The wind screamed outside, rattling the very foundations of the jail. It was the sound of war. It was the sound of a last chance. Elias walked to the iron door of his cell and gripped the cold bars, his knuckles white. He pulled, testing its strength, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching. He would not die in this cage. He would not let her fight alone. The dust storm's fury was a blacksmith's hammer, beating against the stone walls of the jail, trying to pound them into dust. But then the storm broke. The choking red powder turned to a thick, driving slurry of mud and rain. The howl of the wind became a torrential roar. It was chaos. It was cover. The frame of that window is rotten. Josiah's voice was a low rumble beside Elias in the near-total darkness. Barlow's too cheap to fix it proper. Put your strength into the bottom corner. Elias needed no other encouragement. He wedged his fingers into the small gap between the wood and stone, ignoring the splinters that drove deep into his flesh. He braced his feet against the wall and pulled. For a moment, there was only the groaning protest of old wood. Then, with a scream of rusted nails and a crack of splintering timber, a section of the window frame tore free from the stone. It was just large enough to squeeze through. "Go," Josiah urged. "Go be the man she needs you to be." Elias scrambled through the opening, dropping into the muddy alley behind the jail. The rain was a physical blow, plastering his thin shirt to his skin in an instant and washing the grime from his face. He ran, a desperate, slipping flight through the backways of Redemption. The town a collection of ghostly, rain-lashed shapes. The stables were unguarded, the deputies seeking shelter from the storm's ferocity. He found his horse, saddled it with trembling hands, and rode out into the tempest, not as a furtive shadow, but as a man charging headlong into the heart of the storm. The world dissolved into a primal chaos of wind, water, and darkness. The plains were a treacherous sea of mud, the horse stumbling and sliding with every stride. Elias rode bent low over the animal's neck, the rain stinging his eyes. His only guide the faint, instinctual sense of direction toward Naya's camp. He was no longer just a man fleeing. He was a messenger, a prayer, a single point of desperate purpose in a world gone mad. He saw the campfires first, small, defiant points of light struggling against the deluge. He was nearly upon the perimeter before the sentries saw him, their dark shapes rising from the mud like spirits of the earth. "It's Elias! I have to see Naya!" he roared over the wind, not slowing his charge. They ran alongside him, shouting warnings he couldn't hear, their rifles aimed but slick with rain. He rode directly into the heart of the camp. A place of organized chaos. Warriors were moving with quiet urgency, checking weapons, securing tents. Their movements economical and deadly. They were a force preparing for a battle they knew was coming. He vaulted from the saddle before the horse had even stopped, his boots sinking deep into the mire, and staggered towards the large command tent at the center of the camp. 2 guards blocked his path, their faces grim, their spears crossed. "Halt! No one!" "Naya!" Elias bellowed, his voice raw with desperation. "Naya!" The tent flap was thrown open. She stood there, silhouetted against the warm lantern light within, her face a mask of cold fury at the disruption. She saw him then, a wild, half-drowned creature covered from head to foot in mud, his hair plastered to his skull, a trickle of blood from a cut on his forehead tracing a path through the grime on his face. "Let him pass," she commanded, her voice cutting through the storm. Elias stumbled past the guards and into the relative quiet of the tent. It was a general's world. Maps were spread across a makeshift table, weighted down with stones. Weapons were neatly arranged on a rack. For a moment, he just stood there, dripping water and mud onto the canvas floor, a being of pure chaos in her world of order. And then, his strength gave out. He fell to his knees before her, the squelch of his muddy trousers loud in the sudden silence. "Don't do it!" he gasped, his head bowed, the words tumbling out in a ragged torrent. "Naya, please! I know what they're planning. I know they deserve your anger. But don't destroy them. Don't become what they are." She stared down at him, her expression unyielding, her arms crossed over her chest. "You kneel before me to beg for the lives of the men who put you in a cage, the men who are at this very moment riding to slaughter my people?" "No," he said, looking up, his eyes pleading, desperate. "Not for them, not for Barlow, or Henderson, or any of the men who hold a rifle. Let them face you. Let them answer for what they've done. I'm not asking for mercy for the guilty." He took a shuddering breath. "I'm asking for the others, for the children, for the blacksmith's boy who doesn't understand the hatred his father taught him, for the baker's wife who gives bread to hungry families, no matter their skin, for the old men who have done nothing but watch the world change around them. They are not your enemy. Killing them won't bring back your people. It will only make more ghosts. It will only make you the monster they pretend you are." His words hung in the air between them, a fragile, desperate plea. He had aimed them at the one place he knew she was vulnerable, the crack in her armor, the memory of the girl who had once needed saving herself. For a long moment, she said nothing. Her face was a storm of conflicting emotions. The commander, forged in 10 years of hardship and driven by a righteous fury, warred with a woman who had cried in his arms by a campfire. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, the slight tremble in her lip she fought to control. Justice demanded a price to be paid in blood, but his plea offered another path, one of mercy, a path that she had long ago believed was a luxury she could not afford. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and strained, thick with the weight of her choice. "You speak of innocence," she said. "It is a word that is easy to say for a man who has never had his torn away from him. You want me to see the innocent people in your town. You want me to show them a mercy that was never shown to me." She took a step toward him, her gaze boring into his. "Then you will see why that mercy is so hard to grant. I will not give you an answer now, but I will give you a choice. A force is about to ride out from this camp, not to attack your town, but to go to a place of memory, a place of ghosts. You will ride with us. You will come to the banks of Red Creek. You will stand on the ground where my family was erased from the world. You will see the truth you have spent 10 years trying to forget. And then, when you have seen it, when you have truly understood the debt that is owed, then you may plead with me again for the lives of your innocent." She was not granting his request. She was testing its foundation. She was demanding that he bear witness, that he share the burden of her past before he could ask her to spare his future. "I'll go," Elias said without hesitation, the words a solemn vow. She gave a single, sharp nod. An hour later, Ellis was on a fresh horse, riding beside her at the head of a column of 20 of her most elite warriors. The worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple clouds and a world washed clean, dripping in the darkness. They rode in silence, a procession of ghosts moving through the night. The warriors kept a respectful distance, leaving their commander and the strange, mud-caked white man in a bubble of solitude. They stopped once to rest the horses in a small, sheltered canyon, away from the others. They stood in the deep darkness, the only sound the dripping of water from the rocks and the soft breathing of the horses. Elias felt a profound, unspoken sorrow radiating from her, the weight of the journey ahead pressing down on her. He didn't know what to say, what comfort he could possibly offer. So he simply reached out, his hand finding hers in the darkness. Her fingers were cold, but they did not pull away. She laced them with his, a grip that was not one of passion or romance, but of a shared, unbearable burden. It was a silent acknowledgement that their paths, which had diverged so violently a decade ago, had now converged once more. They stood there for a long time, two solitary figures holding hands in the dark, riding toward the ghosts of the past, with no promise of a future at all. They rode through the remainder of the night, and as the first bruised streaks of dawn bled across the eastern sky, they arrived. Red Creek was not a place on a map. It was a wound in the earth. The rain had washed the air clean, and the morning was cool and quiet. Too quiet. It was the unnatural silence of a graveyard, a place where the songs of women and the laughter of children had been violently and permanently silenced. The land itself bore the scars. Elias saw the charred skeletal remains of lodges, their blackened timbers like broken ribs sticking out from the earth. Wild grasses and stubborn weeds had tried to reclaim the ground, but they could not hide the truth. He saw the faint, circular depressions in the earth where a community had once thrived. This was not a battlefield. It was a home that had been burned to the ground. Naya dismounted, her movement slow and deliberate, as if walking on hallowed ground. She led him forward on foot, her hand never leaving his, her grip a lifeline in a sea of ghosts. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The evidence screamed from the silent earth. She led him to a cluster of low, unassuming mounds of earth, now overgrown with wildflowers whose beauty seemed a profound sacrilege. "My father is here," she said, her voice a soft, hollow thing. "My mother, my little brother, who was only 7 years old." She pointed to another mound, slightly separate from the others. "The boy I was to marry." Elias looked at the simple, unmarked graves, and the abstract horror of a massacre coalesced into an unbearable, specific grief. These weren't statistics or enemies of the state. They were a family, a future, a world. He saw a small, carved wooden horse, half buried in the mud near one of the mounds, its paint long since faded. The toy, so innocent and so out of place, broke something deep inside him. The air grew thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. The warnings he had given her, his pleas for the innocent of redemption, all felt like a fool's empty words in the face of this absolute, desecrated innocence. His knees gave out. He fell to the damp earth, not with a cry or a sob, but with a silent, total collapse. The strength, the will, the very breath left his body. He knelt there in the mud, his head bowed, his hands covering his face as if to shield himself from a truth so terrible it was blinding. He could not speak. He could not think. There were no words for this. There was no apology vast enough, no regret deep enough to bridge the chasm of this crime. He simply knelt and wept, his body racked with silent, agonizing tremors, his tears a useless, pathetic rain on a land already soaked in blood. Naya stood beside him, her own grief a stoic, silent pillar of strength. She let him weep. She let him feel the full, crushing weight of the history he had been complicit in through his silence. When his sobs finally subsided, leaving him empty and shuddering. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "This is not all," she said softly. "There is one more place you must see." They rode for 2 more hours, arriving at the sun-bleached, imposing walls of Fort Griffin. To Elias, it had always been a symbol of order, of protection. Now, seeing it through her eyes, it was a cage. The soldiers at the gate watched with suspicion as Naya, in her warrior's attire, and her escort approached with a white man in their midst. But her confident, commanding presence gave them pause. She spoke briefly with an officer, her tone leaving no room for argument, and they were granted entry. She led him not to the officer's quarters or the main yard, but to a long, low-slung building at the rear of the compound, a windowless storage shed that had been crudely converted into a makeshift prison. The air inside was stagnant and thick with the smell of despair and unwashed bodies. "They brought me here," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the emotion she had shown at the creek. It was the detached tone of a historian recounting a distant, painful fact. They did not see a girl whose family had been murdered. They saw a valuable survivor, a curiosity, something to be studied, interrogated. She stopped in front of a small, partitioned-off section at the very end of the shed. It was not a cell. It was a pen, no larger than a horse stall, with rough wooden bars separating it from the rest of the building. "This was my home for 6 months," she said. Elias stared into the small, dark space. He saw the rough-hewn walls, the dirt floor. He could almost feel the suffocating confinement, the endless, terrifying solitude. He ran a hand over the wooden bars, his fingers tracing a series of small, frantic scratches in the wood. "What are these?" he whispered. "The days," she answered simply. "I was trying to hold on to time, so I would not lose myself completely." In that moment, Elias finally understood the full scope of his betrayal. His cowardice had not just led to her capture. It had led to this solitary confinement, this slow, grinding erosion of the soul. He had not just handed her over to the soldiers. He had abandoned her to this living tomb, where she was left alone with her grief and her terror, scratching out the days on a wooden wall to prove she still existed. The guilt he had carried for 10 years felt like a pale imitation of the suffering she had actually endured. They left the fort and made camp as dusk began to settle. In a quiet grove of cottonwoods a few miles away, the warriors kept their distance, understanding that this was a night for their commander alone. Elias built a small fire, the familiar task a small comfort in a world that had been tilted off its axis. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the silence between them no longer filled with anger or tension, but with a profound, shared sorrow. He looked at her face, illuminated by the gentle flames, and he saw not the fearsome commander or the ghost of his past, but the woman who had survived it all, the woman who had scratched the days into a wooden wall and refused to be erased. "Naya," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I have no words. 'I'm sorry' is a child's phrase for a broken toy. It means nothing here." She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw no walls in her eyes, only a deep, weary sadness, and something else, a flicker of understanding. "I know," she said. He stood up, walked around the fire, and sat down beside her. He did not reach for her with the desperation of their last encounter, but gently, tentatively, he took her hand. She did not pull away. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture of fealty, of reverence. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a silent surrender. He put his arm around her, drawing her close, and held her as the last light faded from the sky. There were no more arguments to be had, no more accusations to be made. He had borne witness to her pain, and in that shared space, something new began to form. Later that night, in the quiet darkness of the tent, they came together for a third time. It was nothing like the nights that had come before. There was no desperate passion, no frantic hunger, no fury seeking release. It was a slow, tender, and sacred act of healing. It was the quiet language of two souls who had seen the worst of each other and the world, and had found their way back. His touch was a silent apology, an offering of solace. Her response was an acceptance, a granting of forgiveness. It was not the joining of two bodies seeking pleasure, but the fusion of two broken spirits finding sanctuary in one another, creating a fragile, precious peace in a world that had only ever offered them violence. It was a vow made not in words, but in a quiet, profound connection that finally, after 10 long years, made them whole. The next morning, they awoke to a world washed clean. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. Naya stood at the opening of the tent, looking out at the new day. A decision had settled in her, calm and clear. "We are going back," she said, not looking at him. "To fight?" he asked, his heart sinking. She turned to face him, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. "No," she said. "To talk. One last time. Your words about the children. They were not a fool's words. Vengeance will not build a future for them. It will only plant more seeds of hate. I will offer them a choice, not between war and submission, but between justice and their own destruction." Elias rose and stood before her. He took her hands in his. "Then I'm going with you," he said, "not as a prisoner, not as a messenger. I will stand beside you, in front of the whole town. Let them call me a traitor. I don't care. My home is not a place on a map anymore. It's wherever you are." For the first time since her return, Naya's smile reached her eyes. In his declaration, she saw not just the atonement of a guilty man, but the unwavering allegiance of an ally, a partner. She had returned to redemption with an army at her back, but now, for the final confrontation, she would return with something far more powerful, a man who had seen the depths of her pain and chosen to stand with her in the light. They returned to redemption at high noon, the sun a merciless eye in a white-hot sky. Naya did not lead an army this time, but a delegation. Elias rode beside her, not behind, his presence a stark and public declaration. They were met in the town square, a dusty, open space that now felt like an arena. The entire town had gathered, their faces a gallery of fear, hatred, and a grim, anxious curiosity. Elias saw the faces of men he had known his whole life. The baker, the stable master, his former employer, Miller, and in their eyes, he saw his own reflection as a traitor. He met their gazes without flinching. His allegiance was no longer to a place, but to a person, and to the justice she represented. Sheriff Barlow and Henderson stood before the church, a self-appointed council representing the town's stubborn, violent heart. Naya's warriors formed a silent, disciplined semicircle at the edge of the square, a powerful but restrained presence. Naya dismounted, and Elias with her. They walked to the center of the square, 100 pairs of eyes following their every step. She did not raise her voice, yet it carried with the clear authority of a bell in the tense silence. "I have not returned to burn your town," she began, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "I have not come to demand a life for a life. Vengeance is a fire that consumes everything, leaving only ashes. I have come to demand a future." A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the speech of a savage chieftain they had been expecting. "This is what justice looks like," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "First, every man, woman, and child held in bondage on your ranches will be freed and allowed to join my people. If they so choose, their labor will no longer be the foundation of your prosperity." Henderson's face darkened, but he remained silent. "Second, you will cede the lands of the Red Creek Valley to my people by legal and binding deed, to be our home, where we may live and worship according to our own traditions, unmolested." "Third," she said, her voice dropping, becoming intensely personal, "and this is not negotiable. You will raise a monument in the center of this square, a simple stone, and on that stone you will carve the names of every man, woman, and child of my village who died at Red Creek. Their names will not be forgotten. They will not be erased. You will live every day with the memory of what was done. This is not a punishment. It is a remembrance. It is the only way a wound can ever begin to heal. She fell silent. Her demands were audacious, yet they were not demands of war. She had asked for land, freedom, and memory, not blood. For a moment, a fragile, improbable hope flickered in the air. Elias saw it on the faces of some of the women, on the old men who were tired of fighting. They saw a path away from the bloodshed they had all feared. But the hope was a candle in a hurricane. Jedediah Henderson took a step forward, his face purple with rage. "You dare?" he roared, his voice cracking with fury. "You come here with your army of mongrels and make demands of us. We built this town from nothing. We don't negotiate with savages." It was the signal. The world exploded. The sharp crack of a rifle shot from the roof of the saloon shattered the silence. It was followed by a dozen more from hidden positions in alleys and windows. It was an ambush, treacherous and cowardly. Screams erupted from the crowd as people scrambled for cover. Naya's warriors, disciplined even in chaos, instantly moved to form a protective shield, some falling in the first volley. In the heart of the maelstrom, Naya stood frozen for a split second, her face a mask of shock and a deep, soul-crushing disappointment. Another shot rang out, this one from a second-story window of the general store. Elias saw the glint of the rifle barrel, saw it level directly at Naya's heart. There was no time for thought, no time for a warning. There was only instinct, a final, absolute act of devotion. He threw himself in front of her, a desperate, lunging shove that sent her stumbling backward. He felt a white-hot, searing impact in his side, a force so powerful it lifted him from his feet. The world went silent for a moment, the sounds of gunfire and screaming fading into a dull roar. He hit the ground hard, the dusty earth rushing up to meet him, and a profound, spreading warmth bloomed from the hole in his side. Through a haze of pain, he saw Naya's face above him, her eyes wide with a horror that eclipsed everything else. A cold, lethal fury, the fury of the commander he had first seen, descended upon her features. Her warriors saw it too. They gripped their weapons, their knuckles white, their bodies coiled like springs, awaiting the single word from her that would turn redemption into a funeral pyre. The town was at her mercy. The order to retaliate, to slaughter every man, woman, and child, trembled on her lips. But then her gaze dropped from the faces of her enemies to the face of the man bleeding out in her arms. She saw his pain. She heard his plea from the storm-racked night. "Don't become what they are." She saw the terrified face of the blacksmith's boy, peering from behind a water trough. Her voice, when she finally screamed an order, was not the one anyone expected. "Hold!" she roared, the command of physical force that seemed to stop the bullets in the air. "Hold your fire! Form a defensive line! Protect our fallen!" The command was so shocking, so contrary to the laws of vengeance that had always governed this land, that it stunned both sides into a tense, breathless silence. The ambushers, expecting a suicidal charge, hesitated. In that hesitation, the battle was over. The chaos subsided into a standoff, the two sides watching each other over the bodies of the fallen. And in the center of it all, Naya knelt in the dust, oblivious to everything but the man she held. She tore a long strip from her tunic, pressing it hard against the gushing wound in his side. His breathing was shallow, his eyes beginning to glaze over. "Elias," she whispered, her voice breaking, stripped of all its command, leaving only the raw terror of a woman about to lose everything. "Stay with me, please. Don't you leave me." She leaned her forehead against his, the tears she had held back for a decade finally falling, hot and fast, mingling with the blood and the dust on his skin. "Stay with me," she choked out. "I love you." The seasons turned on the plains, burying the past in dust and snow, and then, eventually, in the fragile green of new life. The town of Redemption did not burn, but it was forever changed. Humbled by Naya's mercy and shamed by the treachery of their leaders, the townspeople reluctantly agreed to her terms. Henderson and his men were exiled, disappearing into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. And in the center of the town square, a simple stone monument was raised, its surface covered in the unfamiliar, silent names of the dead. Elias survived. The bullet had shattered his hip, leaving him with a deep, abiding pain and a pronounced limp. He leaned heavily on a cane carved from the heart of a cottonwood tree, his riding days over forever. The life of a cowboy was a distant memory. He and Naya lived in the valley of Red Creek, in the new community she was building. It was not a town, but a settlement of hope, a place called home. Tents gave way to sturdy wooden lodges, and the fields that had once been stained with blood were now planted with corn and squash. It was a haven for the displaced, the freedmen, the native survivors, the outcasts who had nowhere else to go. Elias, unable to work the range, found his purpose at a new forge, its hammer fall not a sound to drown out memory, but a rhythm of creation, beating out a new future, one piece of iron at a time. Prejudice did not vanish from the world. Riders from Redemption would sometimes watch their settlement from the distant mesas, their resentment a silent poison on the wind. The peace was a fragile, living thing that had to be tended to every day. But it was real. One morning, just as the sun began its ascent, Elias and Naya stood on a small rise overlooking their home. The first rays of light spilled over the horizon, painting the red earth in brilliant shades of gold and rose. He stood leaning on his cane, and she stood beside him, her hand resting on the small of his back, a simple, steadying presence. The light caught them, two figures etched against the vast, empty landscape, one bent, one straight, both unbroken. They did not speak. They simply watched the dawn, the promise of another day. The light washed over them, warm and clean, like a love that had walked through the fire and been reborn from the ashes. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Thank you for listening to this story from the Wild West campfire. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We'd love to hear from you. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for more tales from the Old West, and share your thoughts on Elias and Naya's journey.